So I grew up in a place called Abbott's Cross, a little garden village in Newton Abbey, just near Rathcoole. My father was a firefighter. He was based at, for most of his life, at Witness Street. He was originally from the Shankill. So his dad died when his mother was pregnant with him. My mother was from County Down. Her father was a gardener in the civil service, and she moved to Belfast in her late teens. Her mother died very young, so she brought up her siblings. She worked at STC in Monkstown. My dad retired at 50 because of his eyesight. Him and my mum spent the last 20 winters of their life living in Goa in India. I passed 11 plus, went to Belfast High School, and then I went from the high school to a local tech, and then I went to what was then the Ulster Poly. I took an economics degree. I came over to England in 85, done a gap year. I worked here for a year, and then I finished my education at LSE, stayed in London until 1990. I joined the civil service. It was a fast track entrance to the civil service. So I'd done 3 years in civil service, working in the Treasury and in the late 1980s. I ran a dole office in East London. I was the youngest person in the country to run a dole office as part of this fast track scheme. And then I went off to live abroad for 5 years, and I worked for Time Life. So I kind of worked in the media and things like that. So I lived in Australia, in Sydney in Australia, and I lived in Denver in Colorado. In the 1990s, I came back and I sort of used my background in public policy and media to take on a number of roles in government kind of bodies. I was the director of 3 government bodies between 95 and 2002. And I've been kind of working for myself for the last 18 years. I worked for Channel 4 from 2002 to 2010. And then I worked with David Cameron for 4 years, working on various things, including The Big Society. I set up a charity for him and done a lot of work around this new area of social investment. Set something called this Big Society Capital, which has invested hundreds of millions of pounds in social ventures. And over the last 4 years, I've been involved in a number of campaigns and lobby campaigns around drug reform. So I now, as well as doing freelance work in public affairs and comms, I lead and run 2 industry bodies that are focused on medical cannabis and commercial extracts of cannabis, which is commonly known as CBD. So I run 2 industry associations in that area. It was only really when I first went to Jordanstown that I was first exposed to Irish culture. That was the first time I actually felt like I don't actually really know this place that I'm growing up in, really, in a sense. But this was my kind of first kind of serious exposure to it, because, as you know, the music scene in Northern Ireland in the early 80s and things like that, in the late 70s and early 80s was, like ardently non-sectarian and things like that. But this was something, I was confronted with a kind of visceral kind of nationalism I had not been exposed to before. I, of course, come to terms with it, because you do. I remember the jolt of that early experience hasn't left me. So 100 years of nationhood, separate from the UK, have embedded a kind of furniture, or it feels separate from me. And sometimes I might feel the same way I'm in Scotland, to be honest. Do I go to Edinburgh and feel it's a different place? It's somewhat, yes, in the same way I do when I leave Belfast and go to Dublin. There's something about the fabric of the place that does, I wouldn't say it never feels alien to me, it just feels different. There's always been a sense that there's always been people, proponents, who say, as long as we have an NHS, there'll never be an Ireland. I've heard that numerous times from people. Why would you want to forsake free healthcare at the point of use for some abstract idea of nationalism, particularly if there is a increasing acceptance of your being able to express your nationalism within the context of modern day Northern Ireland. And I think that's something we should come on to in a second. People are generally taking these sort of things for granted: the state pension, the NHS, the education system. And I suppose the BBC and the influence the BBC has on our lives, I suppose most of it's taken for granted. People would have to confront those things in a way they don't have to at the moment. Right? If a referendum was looming, suddenly those things which are run of the mill part of your life, suddenly things like that would suddenly, you have to start thinking about what you'd be losing rather than what you'd be gaining. And therein lies, I think, the biggest problem for the nationalists. For the first time, that people would have to start thinking about the cost of this and what they'd be forsaking, you know. And you're absolutely right with the NHS in a sense. Well, you know, the NHS, we're seeing this currently with the vaccination programme and that's been undertaken since the start of the year. There is plainly a lot of social benefits from having a system like that, and no prospect of it being created in Ireland anytime soon.
Do you think as the vaccination programme expands in the UK, that could also be a kind of an example, if you like, about...
You can see already people sharing the infographics and sharing the graphs and things like that. So, you know, I saw that quite a bit yesterday from people in Northern Ireland sharing the Our World in Data infographics and stuff like that. So I think there is definitely a kind of, I think that chasm will open up over the coming weeks and so on. There's bound to be, I think that if the speed of the vaccination becomes a proxy for thinking about your healthcare system, then that's going to be, I would have thought, a quite dramatic impact, unless there's something going to happen quite soon in the Republic, because at the moment, and it's also going to fortify against some of the concerns about Brexit. Northern Ireland is 20 years after the, you know, in the aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement and things like that, and everything, you know, 20 years on, or 20 odd years on. So I think it feels to me like Northern Ireland's a different, I mean, there's more plurality, there's a kind of, I quite like this sort of emerging sense of almost like a Northern Ireland identity among young people and things like that. And the Alliance Party sort of talks to that for me, rather than, I don't see enough adaptation within parties on the Republican or the Unionist side to the Northern Ireland that should be evolving after 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement. We've put in place kind of our constitutional framework. I feel like in some ways societies become more evolved to a kind of cross-community way of working. The constitutional settlement that we've reached, in a sense, has only really rewarded parties of extreme. And you know, I don't know how you break. I don't really know how you break that, to be honest, Henry. Yeah, I think that notion of Northern Irishness and sustaining that, allowing for freedom of cultural expression, things like that, and emphasizing how that's evolved over the years would be at the heart of what I'd be trying to do. I think infuse the campaign with, yeah. So it'd have to be inclusive, it'd have to be generous, it'd have to be optimistic. I suppose you'd probably think about leveraging the ability to work with both the EU and the UK in this separation. And who's that plays this notion of exceptionalism that could exist. The messaging and the iconography were all about that sense of coming together in a special place. That's what I'd be kind of building around, is playing on the idea of, in a sense, of Northern Ireland being a new country, and a new country post-Troubles, a new country with this new settlement with the EU and things like that. What I've been trying to basically portray is this thing's too nascent. It's too early to be disrupting it, right? And I think that sense of rebirth over the last 20 years, this is a young adult. You wouldn't want to be expose a young adult to something as disruptive as this, you know. So I'd start the campaign as a Good Friday Agreement would be the sort of basis of the foundation for how we've come to this place, you know. So I would probably, I suppose what I would tacitly trying to do is leaving people to think about what's the potential for something like the Troubles to return in a scenario, right? So I think it would be so I think that would be kind of where I'd be kind of coming from, right? So it would be very much about engaging with imagery that was cross-community and things like that, you know, telling the story of how there has been advancements and an evolution in terms of the ability of the nationalist community to be able to express its cultural identity. I just go back from time to time. I can see lots of evidence of that as well, you know, both in the media and things like that wasn't there when I was a kid. Like there was no Gaelic football coverage on local news and things like that when I was a kid. I was born a unionist and I've lived within the union. It would be a wrench for me in the last part of my life, see a fracture between how I grew up and what made me and where I am today, in a sense. I know Northern Ireland's a different place than the one I grew up in, and I kind of am skeptical about what the benefits would be for the wider community of breaking things up.